Okay, it's 2 o'clock and I think we're going to start while people join us still. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to welcome you to the final week of the Impact Festival, and I believe it's the final event of today as well, where the focus is on considering an ecosystem of services. My name is Trinh Ederwald. I'm the head of evaluation at the Education Endowment Foundation, and I'll be hosting this session today, focusing on the use of trials to progress our understanding of what works in children's social care. Now, over 5 weeks, the Center for Homelessness Impact and the partners have created this lovely space for us to meet, to explore ideas, to learn new skills, and to build a shared sense of what we want to achieve in homelessness over not only the coming months, but years, essentially. And the theme for this year's festival is accelerating impact. And this is a theme that has been actually quite pressing across a number of sectors. And it's become particularly pressing theme when huge changes and strides have been made in 2020 in response to the coronavirus pandemic that is still sweeping the globe. So what we're going to do in today's session is we will explore how trials are being used to determine which interventions are most effective in improving outcomes for vulnerable children. And in this session, we're trying to sort of surface the perspectives of thought leaders in research, experts by experience, and also bringing in frontline staff views in children's social care. And on that note, I'm very excited to introduce our panel for today's session. So we have Michael Sanders, who's the Chief Executive of What Works for Children's Social Care, one of the government What Works centers, having served as Chief Scientist at the Behavioral Insights team prior to taking up this role. Michael's also a reader in public policy at King's College London and an Associate Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Governance at the University of Oxford. We have Jen Seabright, who's a children's social worker for Leeds Children's Social Work Services. And prior to undertaking social work training and qualifying as a social worker, Jen worked for Leeds City Council for 15 years initially within the Youth Offending Service. And she began her career in social care in housing and supporting young offenders in their own tenancies. So she has lots of local authority experience. And last but not least, we have Casey Armstrong. Casey is a care leaver after having spent time in local authority care. To do a lot of awareness raising work and pushing for much needed change in the sector. Before we open the platform to our panelists, I wanted to say that we very much welcome your questions and comments. Up as the session progresses, please post them into the Q&A box that you'll find in the bottom center of your screen. And I will do my best to put them to the panelists to answer towards the end of the session. Then for those who are active on Twitter or use any other social media, the hashtag for the festival is CHIFest2020. Please get involved with the conversation on Twitter too. We very much welcome that. Without further ado, I want to hand over to our speakers today, and I'm going to pass it on to Michael as our first speaker, who will tell us a little bit more about the work of What Works Center for Children's Social Care.
Thanks, Trinh, and thank you everybody for being here. I will talk rapidly about some of our work, and I hope everyone can see my slides. Some kind of hand gesture would be good. Excellent. So I will now talk about our work, but particularly focusing on randomized control trials in children's social care, in part because that's what this session says on the tin. It should be said that about half of our work is randomized control trials. The other half is using other methodologies. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we are, going to think about a bit about what an RCT is in case anybody has come to the session thinking it's about road traffic collisions or something. Talk about why we run them in children's social care, and talk a little bit about some of the risks of this approach to try and give as rounded and an argument as somebody who runs trials for a living can do. So who are we? We're an independent organization like the Center for Homelessness Impact. We are and indeed the Education Endowment Foundation. We are a What Works Center. We are funded by government, but we are an independent charity, and it's our job to collate and draw together the best possible evidence, to where there are gaps in that evidence, to fill them by creating new evidence, and then translate that evidence so that it's accessible to people who might want to be able to use it. So busy social workers and the like. And the sort of goal of that work is to be as useful as we possibly can be to the profession, to senior leaders and decision makers, and to policymakers. That means that our research needs to be practical. There needs to be somebody who can actually use it to do something with their work, and it needs to be delivered in as timely a way as possible. One of my favorite anecdotes is when one of my colleagues had a meeting with Samantha Power, then the US ambassador to the United Nations, about the Ebola crisis. An academic in the room said, "That's excellent. It's good to hear you want to get evidence, because we'll have a systematic review coming out in 12 months' time, which in the face of a pandemic, as we are in now, is probably a little bit slow for most policymakers. So we need to be as quick as we can be in order to be as helpful and as useful as we can do." So what we do, as we say, is to bring together the best available evidence to practitioners and other decision makers across the sector. We do that by pulling together what we already know. There's a lot of existing research and existing evidence out there, and so part of our job is to bring that together somewhere that's accessible, where you don't have to pay £30 to download a PDF as you do on many academic journals websites. Our job is also to support good work that's already happening. So there are 30,000 social workers working across 152 local authorities in England, many of whom are doing really excellent and innovative work, and it's our job to stand behind them, to support that, and to help them to build their own evidence base and their own understanding of the work that they're doing. Sometimes that means commissioning new research or commissioning new trials, new other forms of evaluation, and commissioning development work so that people can develop the good ideas that they have but don't have the space to put into practice. We try to give practitioners, young people and families a platform to share their experiences of practice and their lived experience of being involved in children's social care, so that can both feed into our research and that they can be aware of what our research is saying and how that might be valuable to them. And we are committed to trying to improve the accessibility and relevance of evidence. That means making sure that everything is firstly written in plain English, but also available somewhere that people can find it. One thing I'm learning in this job is that my passion for bar charts is not shared by absolutely everybody else in the world, which is a real shame. But there are other things we can use. So it's really important. We are quite a wonky organization. We do a great deal of research, and I am a researcher by background. But it's really important that we do remember why we're doing this, which is to ensure the best possible outcome for children, young people, and for their families. So that's the sort of the guiding star of everything that we're doing. I'm not doing this as an academic exercise. This is something where we believe that research can make a real difference to people's lives. So what is an RCT? So an RCT basically does what it says on the tin. It's randomized insofar as people are assigned at random to one of multiple conditions, the smallest number of which is 2. It's controlled, which means the people who don't receive the new intervention, the thing that we're testing, will usually be assigned to a control group. So they'll only receive service as usual. We would never, in this context, deprive somebody of a service they would otherwise have gotten. This is about them getting either what they were getting before or something new or different. And it's a trial, which means that we are trying to learn something, and that we tend to arrive at an adjudication about whether or not something is effective or not effective. Usually slightly more nuanced than that. This isn't a sort of guilty, innocent kind of trial, alas. It's not that straightforward. What does random mean? Random has a lot of meanings to a lot of people. When I was a young person, it meant sort of vaguely cool or weird, and I don't think that's what we mean here. It also gives you an indication of about how old I am. So when Clueless was on television, but after it was a film. So randomness means that everyone has the same chance of being allocated to the treatment group as everybody else. So it is fair in that sense. This is often 50%, but it can be lower or it can be higher. So if you had a particularly large scale trial, you could think about assigning many more than 50% of all people to the treatment group. The important point is that when somebody arrives at the trial and when they get random, the process they get assigned, that process is random. So it could be like a flip of a coin or the roll of a die, or more commonly these days, the use of a piece of statistical software on your computer. And that means that people's assignment to a group, whether or not they get the intervention, doesn't depend on their characteristics. It doesn't matter, like the DICE doesn't care if they are the most in need, the least in need within a cohort of people who are eligible. It doesn't care if they're male or female, short or tall, black or white. All it does is it treats everybody equally. And that means that there is no correlation between, there's no relationship between their outcomes and where they get assigned under normal circumstances. In fact, any difference in outcomes that we observe at the end of the trial, we say are being caused by that intervention, because the intervention, the new thing that we're testing, is the only thing that differs between those two groups. This is all if we're doing it properly. An RCT is one of one of several ways of establishing causality. There are a lot of others, and causality, we mean the impact, the effect that one thing has on another. That's what we're talking about. Very often, some of these other methods will be more appropriate if we want, even if we want to answer the same kind of research question, i.e., if I do X, what on average happens next to a series of outcomes. Other tools are appropriate very often for answering those questions, but the RCT is the simplest, the cleanest, and very often the cheapest way of finding out what the impact of something is. It's also very often the quickest way, because of the fact that you need to design an RCT in advance. So you can't go back and say, okay, well, the policy happened 2 years ago, I'm going to run an RCT on it. You have to be there at the beginning. That makes it more complementary, more compatible with using qualitative research, user experience research, and economic evaluation at the same time. So you can be both assessing the impact of the intervention in a very quantitative, causal way, but you can also be getting a real insight into the lived experience of people who are participating in it, and they're the same people at the same points in time, which is much more difficult to achieve with other methodologies. So why do we want to run RCTs in children's social care? So some basic facts for young people, people who aren't familiar with the field. Young people with statutory social care involvement, so that means young people who are subject of either a child in need, child protection plan, or who are in care at some point during their childhood, experience in general, on average, worse outcomes than other young people. They are less likely to get good grades. They're more likely to be the victim of crime. They're more likely to be or to become the perpetrator of a crime. They're more likely to have mental or physical health challenges, both as children and later in life. They are less likely to go to university or other higher education routes. They are more likely to become homeless, and they are more likely to die prematurely. These are a series of statements that are verifiable in the data that exists. They are not cheerful statements, but they are true statements, and they are ones that have to motivate everything that we do, and the reason why I work in this area. Research evidence cannot improve outcomes. That's really important. So my doing an RCT does not actually improve outcomes. We like to pretend that it does, but it doesn't directly. Interventions improve outcomes. So the relationships that somebody forms with a social worker, the work that a social worker might do with somebody's family to support them and to help them, the work of other professionals, be they clinical professionals or others, or just sort of people who a child or a young person or a family can have a relationship with, they make a difference. Material help, very often in the form of making funding available and support available to people and to families, makes a difference. And sometimes legal interventions, such as the removal of a child from their parents and putting them into foster or other forms of care, can do that. Those interventions can or might make a difference. Research evidence by itself cannot do that. But if we don't know what impact something is happening, if we haven't got a good answer to the question, if I do this on average, what happens next, then how can we know what to do? How can we have a system that delivers the amount of care, the amount of support to young people and their families that it needs to, in a way that leads to better outcomes? In order to progress with this, there are some things which we're going to need to acknowledge. We have close to no high quality evidence of impacts in children's services. We don't know the answer to basic questions like about what is likely to happen if we do X or Y, and descriptive analysis can only take us so far. So if we take the case of young people who are in care, we can look at descriptive analysis, which tells us that young people who are in foster care have, in general, worse outcomes than many of their peers. Does that mean that putting them into care was a mistake, a bad decision, and if they had remained with their parents, their outcomes would have been better? It does not mean that, right? It doesn't mean that absolutely at all. It means that there were a series of underlying circumstances which led to the child having to be removed from their parents, which is always a decision that should be taken very seriously. But we cannot just compare young people who go into care with young people who don't and say that these outcomes are caused by a child entering care. And yet, all too often, we do that. We also have the case of interventions like family group conferences, which I'm now conscious that Jen is from Leeds, and therefore I'm going to get told off for saying this. Family group conferences, which Jen can describe in much better detail than I can, are an intervention which aims to, among other things, empower families to be part of their own decision making, remove the power that professionals hold in that kind of context, and is said to lead to a reduction of the need for young people to enter care. It is a really wonderful idea, and there are a lot of advocates for it who are very compelling, not least of which is everybody I've ever met who lives in Leeds. The research evidence on this, which is the high quality impact evidence, is almost entirely from the US and is very scarce, shows that there is no real impact in the need for a child to enter care as a consequence of family group conferences, and that for some minority groups, particularly in the US context, African Americans, there is some evidence that it in fact leads to higher rates of children from being removed from their parents. I don't know if that's the case in the UK. I don't necessarily believe the findings of the research that I've just described, because it's in a very different context and lots of the samples are very small. But it feels like it is important for us to know this. And that sort of leads on to my next point, which is that expert and professional judgment, the beliefs of people who work in a system day in and day out, people with lived experience, are valid and they are essential. We cannot run a system without them. There cannot be any practice in social care without expert and professional judgment. There cannot be any policy in social care without expert and professional judgment. Or there can be policy, it'll just be worse. Non-impact research, so descriptive research, observational research, qualitative research, are valid and essential. We cannot do our jobs well without those things, but they are not flawless. Professionals can be wrong. We know this from the medical literature, the public health literature. Lots of things that we thought worked and make perfect sense on paper don't actually work. And it's really important that we all have the humility to say that we can be wrong. And that is what testing and trialing is about. It's saying, I believe I can be wrong. I want to find out what the impact is of this thing that we are doing. If professionals couldn't be wrong, then all professionals would always agree. If you've ever had a conversation with two social workers can barely agree on anything a lot of the time. And that's a wonderful trait of the profession, but it does suggest there isn't one easy to arrive at answer. So what are the risks of running trials? Trials can only tell us whether something works. They tell us whether or not the outcome measure that we're measuring goes up or goes down. They can sometimes tell us for whom it works, if the study is large enough and we've collected the right kind of data. Often they can't really tell us why they do or indeed don't work. That is not a question that a trial by itself can answer. That's why we need to ensure that there's high quality, qualitative implementation and economic evaluations that take place at the same time, which, whilst they should not be a separable part of a trial, they are separable. You can do trials badly. If you want to answer lots of questions, you need to use lots of approaches. The idea that an RCT is a panacea is a stupid idea, but the idea that they are inherently evil is equally idiotic. There are ethical concerns. If you are withholding an intervention from someone, you need to justify not giving somebody something which you believe will help them. That is a valid ethical concern. But you should also have to justify doing something to families, to children, which you don't have evidence is effective. One of the first talks I gave when I was a million years ago, younger, I was told that running randomized controlled trials and policy was unethical. I was told this by a medical doctor, because if they ran trials in the way that we did in government, then they would be disbarred. The problem is that government doesn't make decisions in the same way as doctors and medics do. The comparison isn't us running a randomized controlled trial or us only using evidence-based things. It's running a randomized controlled trial, running an evaluation of some kind, or just giving the intervention to absolutely everybody, so putting it into the water supply. And if you did that, you would certainly go to prison. But you don't go to prison in policy, you get probably on average re-elected. Running bad trials, ones which are too small to answer the questions that we are interested, asking the wrong questions are unethical, right? So if you try and judge, if you randomize somebody into something which is definitely beneficial, or even if it's not, if it's ambiguous whether it's beneficial or not, but you randomize people, you collect data from them, but you're doing that in a way that cannot possibly lead to greater knowledge being produced, that is an unethical thing to do. So bad trials are unethical. Good trials needn't be unethical. Trials can only answer some questions. For statistical tractability, that means we need to pick things that are measurable at scale, ideally things that are easy to measure. So if anybody wants to hear a funny story about my incompetence, Trin can tell you about the first time I tried to oversee a large data collection exercise in a large number of schools all at the same time, which as it turns out is really hard. Because of the fact that it's really difficult, we will very often rely on administrative data. We will rely on things like GCSE grades. We rely on things like a binary decision of whether or not a child entered care. That is reductive. That does not capture the entire lived experience, the entire life of a child, the entire learning or journey of a child through school or through the children's social care system. It misses a great deal. That the risk of reductiveness is a very real one, and one that we need to be mindful of. And that's why we need to ensure that we have a rich ecosystem of evidence and of research that exists, and which allows us to answer as many questions as possible and to have as full and high resolution an image of what is happening in the world as possible. But really, these are just arguments against running bad trials. Angus Deaton, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, quite a while ago now, published an article last month saying RCTs are bad, in which he attacked bad randomized control trials. And I agree wholeheartedly with Angus that bad randomized control trials are bad. But I also believe that all bad things are bad. It's a tautology. The question is whether or not we should be doing good trials, and the fact that those good trials can tell us meaningful things about what is working, why, and for whom. They can help us to enhance our existing knowledge, which we have from professionals and from others. And I hope they can help professionals to learn about what the next intervention might be, the next thing to do, right? They should not, with this learning process, it's not a one-way street that ends in an RCT. It should be iterative. To summarize, RCTs are only one tool in a researcher's box, and the learnings from them are only one of the things that professionals and others can call on, including their own expert judgment and other forms of evidence. The reality is we don't have very many of them in children's social care. The reason I'm not presenting lots and lots of bar charts to you is not, well, it's partially because I've learned my lesson about presenting lots of bar charts to people, but it's also because we just don't have very many of them that have been conducted. Prior to 2019, when I arrived in post, we think that there have been 2 randomized controlled trials in children's services delivery in England, which is a very small number. For commissioners of research, and this is really important to me, for commissioners of services, professionals, and importantly, people with lived experiences, people to whom the system is often happening, they create an important way to create accountability. If a decision is being taken about your life or with the money which you are spending as a commissioner or as a policymaker, or that you are doing something as a professional, you should be asking, what is the evidence that this thing works? Why are you doing this thing, and does it work? And if it doesn't work, why are you continuing to do it? Is there a good reason? Sometimes there will be. Sometimes people will choose to do practice merely because it is humane, which is a very good reason to do something. But the idea that we might persist in not building an evidence base, we might maintain a willful ignorance about the impacts that interventions can have on the lives of children and young people, does not feel any more ethical than running a bad randomized control trial to me. And that is the end of my song. Thank you ever so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was a brilliant overview of where the trials would fit in the context of service provision, and how the results of trials can inform policy design and service design, and how to change all that. And I hope people will send through lots of questions that we can probe you on later on as well. I would now hand over to Jen in the hope that she'll tell us a little bit more about her experience with interventions, and potentially running trials, being part of trials, and how research fits in that. So Jen, over to you.
Yeah, I haven't taken part in trials myself. I do work for Leeds, and I know that Leeds is part of a a bigger picture and part of the understanding for the family group conferencing and restorative practice and the family valued projects in, as with some other local authorities. So I think what I could lend to what Michael has said and to the afternoon in general is the benefit of where that work is placed within the sort of local authority and work as a social worker kind of on the ground. So Leeds as a whole has taken on a restorative approach, probably going back, I can remember going to some initial training in 2012. And I think what's really important is that Leeds has always implemented these approaches and these different interventions like family group conferencing with the confidence that they had to install in us as social workers, that it worked. And until you have been part of, I think, an authority who was able to kind of say, this is what we want you to do, and we really, really believe in it. And I think because restorative practice, which brings in interventions like family group conferencing, and we're also doing like formulations, so a lot of meetings and a lot of approaches towards looking at plans, but drawing in lots of professionals, are done it in such a way that it's the basis of it. You can be skeptical and you can be informed to go to something and use this intervention, but you come out actually going, it really, really works. It works, and it worked in different ways for different young people and different children. And I've been part of family group conferences with families who were skeptical, and maybe I was skeptical it was going to work with that family, and it did, and it wasn't in all cases about removing children. And I think that was one of the other important things in Leeds, is that it was not just about reducing numbers of children in care, it's about supporting the families to stay together so they don't get to the point where we have to think about removing children. And that again was something which really supported social workers to feel confident in those approaches, and we could give that power balance back to families. So it was always looking at the boxes of, do we do something to a family or for a family? And no, we always try and sit in the box, and we still do. And this is what Leeds still really tries to kind of make us work towards, is we sit with the families, and that's not always great when you're going into, and does it work when you're in perhaps legal proceedings. But I think it can work in different ways. I think it can work in the earlier stages of working within families and working support families as well. And I've worked across a number of different areas within Leeds, so from child protection to looked after, and now into disability, and it's embedded in management. So because it's embedded that way, it's throughout the service. So it's not only in one area of child protection, it's throughout Leeds, and it still feels kind of really exciting because it's still there, and it's just our way, and it makes you feel positive about being able to use those interventions with families.
Brilliant, thank you, Jen. Sorry, I was a bit too slow of getting unmuted. That's really good. That's good stuff. Casey, I was wondering if you could join in and share your perspective and your thoughts based on what you've heard, and how it sort of fits with your experience.
So I think one of the big things that I am picking up on is that obviously there's always sort of a huge debate on whether you keep a child of their family or whether it's at a point where you need to take them into care. And I can understand, as someone that's in the social care profession, that is a very, very huge decision to make. I think one of the things that's quite at the forefront of my mind at the minute is that it's very important to keep a child of their family at all costs, but at the same time, I think it is equally important to recognise when that family isn't salvageable, or there's a lot of instances where I know people that things were just too tense at home and they were still living with their family, and it was actually going into care that gave them the space that sort of allowed them to sort of rebuild their family. And actually sometimes they'll move back home, sometimes they'll move back home after they leave care, and they'll be in a much better state than before they went into care. But another thing as well that I was thinking is that it is that early intervention that is just hugely important. I found with myself, I didn't go into foster care. First time was 14, it was for a few months, got sent back home because no one was really listening. And I was then later on in the year, when I was then 15, taken back into long-term foster care. And I know for myself that meant I had 14, 15 years of chances to have early intervention, but they didn't really do any of that. They sort of kind of got involved when I was about 12, but they hardly did anything. And it was just left, and it was left, and it was left, until it got to a point where the second that I went into care long term, my mum she stopped speaking to me. She completely cut off contact with me. I had no contact with any of my biological family. And ultimately that is probably what led, one of the huge issues, what ended up making me homeless, because when you then leave care, you can't go back to your foster family or your care home if you were living with other children, because it's not possible. They've got other kids there. It's not something that's done. And where most people will lose their accommodation, they move back with their parents. But I didn't have that early intervention, so I had no relationship with my parents. So I had no one to go back to. I had no one to support me there. So I think it's maintaining those relationships are really at the utmost important when you've got a child in care. You really need to make sure that you can do what you can for the relationship with their parents.
Thank you. I think that's a very valid point, and I think it links to this experience of yours, and the sort of wider context links well to the questions researchers face when they're designing research in a sort of public service system setting. It's this case of we're testing interventions, there are underlying logic to these interventions, and we're expecting to see certain kind of outcomes. What we often don't perhaps necessarily investigate in depth is all potential other spin-off effects and other aspects that are not necessarily a direct product of an intervention, but essentially surround the young person and you affect a variety of their outcomes, not perhaps only the ones we measure as part of the trials. Casey, there's been a question that's come through to you. How do you think that your experiences can aid the decisions and projects of organizations like What Works for Children's Social Care and Center for Homelessness Impact?
The one thing that I'm always kind of like preaching is participation. I think it is the most important thing in any service, no matter what it is, whether it's a hospital or if it's a children's home. You need to get the views of the people that the service is for, because at the end of the day, especially social care, it's a very sort of unique service in a way. I always say that someone that has been through the foster care system, it's such a different experience to anything else you can go through. Not many people can really understand it unless you've been through it. So it's really hard for a professional who's, obviously some professionals, they will have been through it themselves, but a lot of them haven't. And for them to then go and make X, Y, and Z decisions that could really impact the child's life when they don't fully understand that. And that's not any ignorance on their part. It's just really difficult for someone to quite get a full grasp of that. So I think I always tell people to get the views and opinions of others that have been through that service, because no one is more of an expert on that than those that are expert by experience, if that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. And to sort of elaborate on that question and move on to some other ones that have come through, I think this one goes to Michael, really, in terms of prioritization of key research areas for commissioning. In your center, how do you do the prioritization?
Trin has frozen for me.
And
Oh, there you are. Sorry, Karen.
I'm not sure how much you lost.
How, I think the question was, how do we prioritize things?
But well, in the stakeholder voice as well.
Yeah. So the way in which we do this, so we ran a large prioritization exercise late last year, early this year, which was sort of a 4-round Delphi process, which was excruciating in many ways, particularly for my colleague Ella, who I should give a shout out to, who had to produce, I think, 1,000 graphs to satisfy my appetite for graphs. And more than 250 people took part in that exercise, including adults who are care experienced, some young people who have experience not just of being in care, but of other forms of intervention with social care. I think it's really important, as Casey said, like that lots of good social work should very often lead to children being supported in such a way and families being supported in a way that they can go into care and then go back to their families, or that they don't go in the first place. But so it's very important that we hear from those young people as well as just people who've sort of spent longer in foster care. So I think we got some responses there. So that was a pretty long and detailed exercise. We also have a young advisors group, which is quite a small group of young people. The reason why it's small is I think it's very easy to pay lip service to listening to the views of young people and care experience young people, and to sort of get 50 of them in a room at once, for me to do a sort of half-hour drive by and say hi, and then to sort of leave and be able to say that I've had these conversations. Having the small group that we do means that Jen will tell me that social work is all about relationships, because social workers all tell me that, especially social workers from, I should say, I love Leeds. I've told my wife, who is a social worker, if we ever leave the city we currently live in, we're moving to Leeds. It's a bit of a commute, but never mind. By having a smaller cohort of young people who I've gotten to know over my 18 months in the role, I am really able to have a meaningful conversation with them about what it is that we're thinking about and what it is that we are doing. We also have a polling platform that we use. So we have 1,000 social workers who we poll fortnightly to ask a series of questions, some of which is what research we do. Some of it is, how are you feeling today? So we've been tracking the well-being of social workers over the pandemic, which means that we are hopefully able to communicate with the department better about people's experiences. And we are working up towards, I think my colleague Bev has already been to the Care Leavers Council in Leeds, and going around talking to other young people about what it is that they are interested in. So that stakeholder engagement is a really important part of a prioritization exercise. As well as that, there is, we have to rely on data in order to help steer where we are looking at things. So the Family Justice Observatory did a really important report showing that the number of young people who were removed from their parents within the first year of their life has been rising really quite fast over the last 10 years or so. The timing of which may be an entire coincidence and nothing else to do with anything else that's going on in the country. I couldn't possibly comment. But the understanding why that's happening, understanding what can be done to support mothers and indeed parents in general, who are giving birth and having their children removed quite quickly. And that's very often happening to the same mothers over and over again. And from conversations with Steve Walker, who's the former Director of Child Services in Leeds, my understanding is a lot of those mothers who are having children removed repeatedly are care experienced women themselves. And so understanding what's going on there and what we can do about it and what can be done to help, I think, is a really important thing. And that's something that doesn't perhaps come through our prioritization exercise, because those parents are not feeding in for one reason or another. We don't hear the voice of health visitors or the voice of midwives particularly clearly in our prioritization exercise. And we really, really, really don't hear the voices of sort of babies under the age of 1. So we have to be led by both data and the very real need that we see there, as well as from the voices of stakeholders. There is also, as you'll know, Trin, the question of, can we actually do research here? So we're doing a piece of descriptive analysis at the moment, looking at outcomes for young people who were referred into and go into secure children's homes. you can't really run a randomized control trial in a setting where you've only got sort of 100 children going in a year. It's vitally important, and research needs to be done, and we need to better understand what's going on there, but it's not something to be done quickly or without a great deal of thought. So that also, the sort of the ability to do high quality research in an area is something that has to govern our prioritization as well. So there are lots of very important things on which we do no research.
Thank you, Michael. To build on the sort of stakeholder involvement question a bit as well, and tapping onto the ethics and running trials that you discussed in your presentation, what has been the reception of practitioners to those arguments that you presented earlier, and how are they kind of getting with you on that journey to understand the value of RCTs? And is there room for co-production to mitigate some of those potential challenges that you might be facing in bringing them on board?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna pretend that all 30,000 social workers think that RCTs are a great idea. I think different social workers respond differently to the idea of different RCTs. So if you are somebody who is who's been using family group conferences for many years, and you've sat in a room and really felt the impact of a family group conference happening, then it's much more difficult for you to think that we exist in a situation of equipoise, i.e. that we don't know whether it works or not, right? That's just much more difficult. Whereas an intervention that is new to you, so if you're a social worker who hasn't used family group conferences before, or if it's a different intervention entirely, it's much easier to understand and to agree with the idea that it's worth doing a test to find out whether it works or not. So I think that's the reality of that. I think I love social workers to the point where I married one. And one of the things that's always struck me is the sort of the intelligence at dealing with ambiguity that social workers have to have in order to do their job, right? So medics, when you talk to them, and conscious there's at least one person with an NHS email address here, I hope they're not gonna get cross with me, but like, doctors tend to want answers when I give talks to them about things. When I give talks to social workers, they are very comfortable with ambiguity. They're very comfortable with the idea that you can't know exactly what happens next, and that everything we're dealing with in statistics is probabilistic, because there are no easy or certain answers in social work except for on incredibly bad days. So I think there is an understanding that evidence is valuable and that it can be useful. I think the question is when we should be using randomized control trials is a question that needs to be answered, and there's a debate to be had within the profession, which we're very happy to contribute to and be part of, is which interventions do we think it's appropriate to be testing using an RCT, which ones do we think should be evaluated in different ways. And, you know, if you'd have told me 2 years ago or asked me 2 years ago, I would have said it would have been an uphill struggle and no one was going to want to be involved in these trials. The reality is I've been in post for 18 months. We have 30 trials on the go. We're working with 112 out of the 152 local authorities in England on those randomized control trials. So people can be convinced that this is the best, that this is an acceptable way of doing it. Random allocation ultimately is, as well as being a good way of learning, it is fair. It doesn't discriminate, as I said at the beginning, on grounds of race or gender or family background. It treats everybody exactly the same, which is something which I think many of us can get behind if it's framed in that way, rather than the dull statistical language of the central limit theorem.
Thank you, Michael. Jen, I have a question for you, which sort of very much draws on your experience in sort of local authority service system, and it's sort of to get your view on to what extent things have changed over the years as well. So when we think about the What Works movement, the challenge we all faced, certainly on the research side, is that we associate what works with positive findings, and there's less appetite for findings that don't say much at all or are negative. And this whole conversation about decommissioning services just because it's not a good use of public money, and this has been a very difficult conversation across the years. And and ultimately sort of transfers to us as professionals as well. In one way or another, we're all in the business of helping people. But asking that question, whether what I do as a practitioner or a professional, does that work? It's a really difficult question to ask as well, to be open to the fact that maybe my own practice isn't perhaps the most effective practice from a young person's perspective in improving outcomes. And I just wonder whether you have any sort of reflections on whether there has been a shift in a sort of practitioner mindset, and how services are run in relation to evidence and evidence use as well.
Yeah, I suppose because my work with the Youth Offending Service was also quite based around evidence-based practice as well. You know, that the basis of that is you know what worked for young people who had been offending, and I suppose, but working within Leeds, you know, I suppose I've just been embedded in a culture that we do things that work. We have been affected by services though that have, you know, that have closed, and there's often, only in the 5 years I've been qualified as a social worker, if I reflect that back to when I worked within youth offending as well, there was much more resource available as a practitioner to go to. So we could, you know, there was this project or this children's centre had you know, a lot more groups, or there were a lot more, you know, family support workers, and so in that respect, I think we're working within, I suppose, since austerity, within a way which you had to embed something in the service, which wasn't so much about how, you know, the money. Obviously it costs money to roll, you know, these programs out, but it wasn't about having, you know, a lot of expensive projects out there. It was about what are the social workers and what are the services on the ground doing that works within austerity, that works, you know, within a way which means that, as Casey said, we're in with families a lot earlier rather than firefighting at the end as well. But yeah, I think we've felt quite, I feel in that, you know, the whole time that I've worked in Leeds across, you know, the council, that things are very, very different. But I guess what's sometimes replaced it is a culture of what can work then, rather than what are we we haven't got anything, you know, we haven't got any money to pay for anything.
Yeah, and in terms of bringing evidence to the practice, the frontline practice and sort of local authorities decision making, what are your reflections on what's sort of worked in a most simple sense? What's worked in creating, first of all, this headspace for practitioners and sort of local policymakers to consider evidence in decision making, and how the embedding has worked? What has helped to embed evidence in local decisions?
So I suppose what's worked in sort of making the decisions is the idea around the kind of the relationships and the restorative nature of it as well. So instead of thinking automatically about the removal of children, it's about what will work to support the family initially. So we don't look at a young child who needs to be removed. We gather around them in the family group conference, the network. And I remember really clearly going on some training very early on about something which they read out, and it's a paragraph from an Aboriginal, because it comes from New Zealand, and it was about a family, a child saying, find whoever, find the person who, you know, is closest to my family, keep me within my family. And I think that's one of the things about the decision making, is that we don't look for anyone and everyone, but we look about who can support around the family or keep the child within the family. And that very early on in child protection was something which I found, you know, was the managers were looking to, you know, to think in that direction, rather than the immediate removal. It happens when it does happen, because sometimes there are no other safe alternatives, and it's right, you know, in some, you know, circumstances. But there are also other circumstances where there are you know, close friends or relatives who haven't been considered, and the plan can go around them in a different way.
Go to Michael this time. Which additional challenges have you faced given the devolved structure of children care, and how are you mitigating them and ensuring your efforts are reaching the largest number of stakeholders possible?
Yeah, so the social care, I should say, is much less devolved than, say, education is. So there are 152 local authorities that deliver children's services. So it's not even all local authorities because of the multi-tiered nature of English local government. So I think from our perspective, I feel very fortunate that children's services is administered in the way that it is. So not having everything run from Whitehall does mean that you have the opportunity for local authorities to design their services in a way that suits their needs and to build a culture locally, very often led by charismatic directors of children's services, which do innovate, although I don't really like the word innovate. They do practice as well as they can do given the circumstances, which looks a lot like innovation to the DFE, and allows for there to be variety. But at the same time, I've been to 30 local authorities last year to see social workers and directors, and to speak to young people, and that's a fifth of the country. If I do this for 6 years and there isn't a global pandemic for the entire duration, I hope to go and see every single local authority. And that means that I can sit in the room with perhaps not every social worker, but social workers in every local authority. I can sit in the room with every DCS, and I can say, you know, the reason I'm doing this is not because I'm just an academic who loves bar charts. The reason I'm doing this is because I passionately believe this is a good way to improve the lives of children. And that if you're in a situation like education, which I know is not the reason we're all here, but obviously you're here, Trin, so I think about it sort of like you've got 24,000 schools. The likelihood that even an organization with the energy and power and drive of the EEF could sit in the room with every single one of those head teachers and say, look, this is a good idea. Well, the reason we're doing this is because we are earnestly and genuinely interested in it. It's impossible. So it's actually much easier for us to bring about those conversations and that change. One of the really big challenges that we face, both as a research center but as a sector more generally, is that 15.4% of social workers left the profession last year. So what that means is that even if I could convince every single social worker in Britain that RCTs are great and evidence is great, then 7 years later, I will on average have a profession that has mostly turned over and has been replaced by different people. So you constantly have to be talking to them and convincing them. So there are a lot of structural things like the general level of funding in children's services, the level of caseload, that sort of passion and mission that Jen has described, and the maintenance of people in the profession that need to be addressed in order for any kind of reform, be it evidence-based or otherwise, to really have any lasting power. And I think, to go back to sort of something you were saying earlier, Trin, it is very difficult when to have take the view that, yeah, my practice might be the wrong thing, my practice might not work, my practice might not be as good as possible. And that is something that, related to that, I think the turnover in the profession is, as a social worker, you can't really win in terms of the national conversation. So either you are a monster who removes children from their families when they shouldn't be removed, or a child dies while being cared for by their parents, or indeed not being, and then you're a monster for not having taken them into care sooner. I think that we need to, in an evidence-based world, we need to move away from blame being assigned, right? So I believe that the overwhelming majority of social workers, the overwhelming majority of social workers are genuinely trying to do the best they can for children and families under enormously difficult circumstances, enormously, both for the social workers and for the families. Our job as researchers is not to cast blame and say you're doing it wrong, your thing doesn't work. It's to say we will stand like in front of you where necessary and behind you most of the time to give you as much support as we can do in being able to make the decisions you're having to make, that do the work you're trying to do as well and as effectively as possible, and not to be blaming somebody for having done the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And not directly linked to that, but I've been thinking throughout the presentations and the Q&A, a comment you made, Michael, about the reductionist nature of trials in terms of what sort of questions they're allowed to answer and how we sometimes sort of, get down to binary yes or no, or some sort of feature of like that. But I do think there is a continuous tension for us as researchers as well to think about, well, what are the interventions we could test out of interest, potentially changing those outcomes, and how much change do they generate versus what is the practical value of those interventions. And if I may, from my point of view, in education, we often test things that aren't radical enough to generate change big enough, and we often see the story in our sector mostly is to see the sort of grade point distribution changing, but not the actual grades. And what we really want to change is the actual grade, right? And I think it's quite important for us from the trials point of view to really truly think, what is it that we're trying to change here, and what's of practical value, and so on. Casey, there's a question that's come through for you, which is about your views on what did you find most useful whilst you were in care, and what benefited you the most?
I think probably the biggest thing that I will always say was probably my foster family. And honestly, I think it was the relationships that I had around me. And the biggest thing about my foster family was the relationship they gave me. For anyone that's gone into care your whole life, you've only ever had a skewed concept of relationships, which can cause some really deep-rooted problems. And I think it was a huge thing for me to be able to be presented with these healthy relationships, so I was able to understand how things really should be. And it also gave me trust, a lot more trust in general people as well, I think, because it's, I don't know, it might seem like a very small thing to anybody else, but it's like any kind of relationship, friendship, a romantic relationship, a professional relationship, it's all stuff that I still don't really understand to this day. And I still do have that skewed concept. But I know that it would have been 10 times worse if I wasn't able to have healthy relationships whilst in care. Because there, as well as my foster family, there were also, it's not just your foster family, it's your CAMHS worker. That was very important to me. And social worker is very important, but at the same time, it is really difficult because my record for the amount of social work changes in 1 month, I had 13 different people and I didn't meet most of them. So it is really hard to be able to build a relationship if they're sort of constantly changing as well. But it is really important to have a relationship with your social worker and maintain just at least one for a year or something like that, I think is really important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we've had an opportunity to hear very different but also very rich perspectives in how trials could bring evidence to the field of children's social care, particularly when it comes to most vulnerable children. It is clear that there's lots to improve on, but it is also absolutely delightful for me as a researcher to see that these things are progressing and that we are finding a good fits across different sectors and across different professions to improve our services going forward. Thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you to all who you've been sharing your thoughts and comments and passing through the questions. Do keep the conversation going using the hashtag CHIFest2020 when you interact with social media. Thank you all very, very much. Have a lovely afternoon and stay hydrated is my recommendation.
Thank you, everyone.